Share that little link, where you get to say quick that one to find out which indigenous land you're on. What was that? Do you know what I'm talking about? There was like a link I thought we used in one of our sessions where people could click there and then you put in where you're coming from and it shows you what land you're on.
C found that for us last time. Let me see if I can find it quick.
Yeah, it's in the So as we're starting to have people roll in, I want to just welcome you. Thank you for being here. And if folks would be willing to just indicate in the chat where you're, maybe your role and where you're coming from. It'd just be interesting for us to get a perspective on who's with us this morning. Or, is it morning? It's noon where I am. So we might have a range of people coming. Late morning to early afternoon.
Try that, Kate.
Yeah, no, I just went to it. You don't see that on the screen though, right? You still see the slides?
Yep. No,
Okay.
we see your
the map.
The map.
Interesting. Okay. Now what do you see? There. Is that better?
Back to slide.
I don't always present off of Google, actually. Yes, and Meg, it is St. Patrick's Day, so for all who celebrate.
It's pretty easy for those of us in 4-H world, right? To just throw on anything that we have that's green. Celebrate for a whole month.
Well, we are a small but mighty group right now. I'm wondering if we just wait one more minute and then we'll jump right in. Where are we at? Well, what do you think? Should we get going and we'll just welcome people as they join? In terms of the host, like, do you want to go ahead and start the recording? Or maybe you already have.
Yeah, we're all set.
You're all set. Okay, perfect. Great. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Kate Walker, and I work at the University of Minnesota in Extension at our Center for Youth Development, where my role is actually as an extension specialist in youth work practice. So much of my work is really around understanding and then supporting those who work with young people. So often, community-based youth workers, as well as our own 4-H staff and volunteers. And then in terms of sort of specific things that I'm dig into, I really focused a lot on the dilemmas that youth workers face in their everyday work, as well as social emotional learning. So those are big areas for me that I've done a lot of trainings and research with. But when in my role, I was also asked to lead up a series around equity, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with my colleagues with you today, the process that we use. But before we go any further, I want them to introduce themselves as well. Nou, can you go next?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nou Yang, and I am calling from Minneapolis in Minnesota. And I've had about 20 years experience working in various capacities in youth development. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, Nou. And Sumaya?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sumaya Hanafi. I'm a University of Minnesota student majoring in developmental psychology. I joined this work as a youth program worker, and it's been a very interesting and meaningful experience.
We're glad you're here as well. So as I mentioned, today what we're going to do is share for you the process that we use to develop a learning series that was all around advancing equity in youth programs. But I can tell you that going into this, I had a lot of reservations, actually a lot of anxiety around what does it mean to have the University of Minnesota, particularly our Center for Youth Development and our 4-H Youth Development program, kind of be leading in this space. I had previously felt quite confident when we would do research around youth program quality or social emotional learning, and thought, we could really dig in and figure out how best to share that out with our other youth serving organizations across the state. But I really knew that this was not the area that we were leaders in. And so we knew right away we needed to partner with youth workers and with young people to help craft something. So really situating ourselves as co-learners to do a much more publicly engaged process to identify what are the barriers, what is this vision, and what are some strategies that might be useful for those of us working with young people to think about advancing equity. So that's where we started from a number of years back. And in doing so, I think it also helps me remember who we are and where we're coming from today. So I just do want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm on stolen land, and that land is the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary home of the Dakota and Anishinaabe. I also happen to live just minutes away from where George Floyd died, and our city is in the middle of the trial, Derek Chauvin's trial. So that's stressful for our community right now. And I know all of us are heavy hearts today as we're thinking of the families of those who were lost in Atlanta, and really, supporting our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. So, in light of all of that, and knowing our young people are swimming in all of that as well, I think it's important for us just to kind of pause and think about that. Nou, Sumaya, anything you'd add to that?
No, thank you, Kate. I guess I want to just add that this little acknowledgement at the end of just acknowledging where we're coming from and what's happening in our current environment is so important when we think about youth equity work, that we can't just show up isolated and compartmentalized, and that this was something that we also did throughout all of our virtual and in-person youth equity workshops. Was we can't talk about equity if we can't name some of the realities that's happening right around us. So it's a good practice. So for all of you who in your work want to advance equity, I would encourage you to think about how do you create space at the beginning to just acknowledge what's going on around us.
I'm going to pop in the chat too. There is a link. I'm not going to dwell on it, but a useful tool. I think if you are thinking about like a land acknowledgement when you're gathering people together, this is an easy way for people to look up where they live and sort of the context of that land. So you can use consider that as well. All right. So for us, actually, I should have the dates on here. This was a multi-year process, and even building up to it took a while as well. Initially, I set out, I actually hired some consultants to help me think about how I was going to frame this up. And so with them, they helped us lead some listening sessions with young people and with youth workers. And really what it helped us understand was some guiding principles for me and for, particularly coming from the University of Minnesota and what that meant. What were some guiding principles for how we wanted to do this work? I guess a little context I should share is that traditionally what we did when we would do a series like this, if it was on youth program quality or if it was on social emotional learning, we'd spend a number of years really digging deep into a topic and really become kind of a go-to source of research-based information for the field of youth work. And often one of the ways that we would share research-based information was by bringing a scholar to come to on campus and stand at a podium with their PowerPoint slides and talk about what is the best practices. And, we did a lot of variety of things in terms of panels and whatnot, but we just knew this wasn't going to work. But we weren't really sure what might work. So the guiding principles helped us think about how we would frame a series differently. And they were things like sharing space and the role of experts. So really, while we knew we were still, people trust us and come to us for a particular kind of knowledge, and we wanted to maintain that kind of rigor and balance it though with also, so practitioners and experts both bringing their expertise and knowledge to this and really highlighting people wanted practical, meaningful tools. And then we knew we were told we needed to lead with vulnerability and transparency. And by that, I really mean we needed to show some institutional self-awareness about what it did mean to be talking about equity. What was the history of how the university or 4-H has approached this before? And how are we kind of, as a host of this series, how are we walking the talk? So parallel to this external work, we were also doing our own first generation work within the 4-H youth development program, sort of letting them learn and kind of feed off of each other a bit. So wanting to be clear about what we were doing ourselves to get better at this, and acknowledging the limitations of where we sat. We wanted to make sure we were ensuring historically silenced voices were centered, right? Really amplify and honor unheard voices, whether that was lifting up effective practitioners and, where was this happening well? How can we learn from you? And also making sure that we were hearing from those who come from traditionally underrepresented cultures, communities, and then above all, engaging and elevating youth voices, making sure this work, we were going to be doing this in a thoughtful, engaged way, kind of from beginning to end. So what that meant, at first I thought that meant we were going to find like a partner organization and just kind of, okay, let's develop this series together. Instead, what we did was put together a community design team, and it was about 20 people, mostly youth workers, actually all youth workers at first, that really, my criteria was that they were working across diverse communities. They were organizations that had a strong commitment to equity, and they had young people kind of at the ready who could be tapped, right, for their perspectives. So that was how we were gonna bring in the youth voice. So the very first meeting we had, this was again just a group of youth workers, and the question on the table, we wanted to just build some trust. We wanted to provide some context, as I've done for you, and really start to get a clear understanding. Well, what are the barriers to doing this work to begin with, right? And so we asked the question: what gets in the way of operationalizing equity? And the group identified 87 barriers. So it was a big, juicy conversation. We ended up organizing those 87 barriers around these 6 different themes. And actually a young person who who had been in the program that Nou works with was the person who was able to create this visual harvest for us for a couple of our sessions. But the overall barriers fell into these kind of 6 themes. First was fear of the consequences of acting opposite of our assigned racial identities. Planning about people without people perpetuates exclusion and white supremacy. Layers of oppression can block self-awareness, which limits growth and action towards equity. Frameworks, funding, policy, and practices are rooted in whiteness. Bias systems perpetuate deficit-based approaches that block fundamental change and the acceptance of oppression as the norm. So there was a lot kind of going into this where we knew like there's a lot of barriers to doing this work, and it cuts across a lot of really significant heavy themes, right? So that was the context that we were entering. And what probably came across most strongly though was even people saying like, and where are the young people? We need the young people to be a part of this conversation. So the next session, actually Nou facilitated. Sumaya was a young person as a participant with many others who came together. And I'm going to ask Sumaya if you want to share with us what that second session was like.
Next, over 20 young people joined the community design team for a speak out session. This speak out session process was intentional about centering youth voices. The purpose was to define equity within youth programs and identify what adults need to know to do to support it. For example, to map out our vision for a series of public learning events focused on exploring and advancing equity within Minnesota's youth-serving organizations. Speakouts are opportunities for different groups to share their experiences as members of the group and to have those who are not part of the group listen and acknowledge their perspectives and feelings. Youth and youth workers were a part of this process, and the participants in this whole process were sharing their thoughts on questions like, what does equity in a youth program look like and feel like for you? What happens in your program that makes you feel like you are valued, treated fairly, and belong? What do you never want to see, hear, or have happen again in a youth program? And what do you want others to know and do to promote equity in youth programs? So we came up with so many ideas and we've grouped them in these major themes, and these are what we've identified as like tips to improve the youth program experience.
Awesome. And I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Like when you think about that day, what do you take away, or how did it feel?
I felt like our voice was being taken seriously, because a lot of times when youth are included in like events and processes like this, it does feel like, you know, we're just there, and it's like, you know, oh, you know, see, we have youth over here as part of this process. But like we were seeing this visual was like one of the like major like, whoa, you know, what we said was taken seriously. And it's not like too like, no idea is like too much. Like we were really thinking like, ideally, what do we want to do to improve the experience of youth and youth programs?
I knew you were facilitating. You actually suggested this process, one you've used in your youth program before. What was powerful for me was the idea that people were talking and the other, like, there was really structured, right? Like to have to listen and you couldn't talk, and then switched roles. I don't know. Did you have anything from either the facilitator or participant perspective there?
Yeah, I think we structured it that way because I think it's often when we're in a room with youth and adults, the adults take over. And it's really hard. We have a lot to say. We have a lot of opinions, even though we want to we're there to listen to young people. And so we just knew that we needed to structure the space so that there was equal time and that youth were really being listened to. And we really wanted to hear what young people were thinking in terms of equity. I think as adults, we have our own thinking about what does it mean? How does it impact our work? But what we learned from this was that young people think about equity, feel equity, and experience equity slightly different than how we as adults think about it. It's not too different. They're on the same path, but what it feels like in that space, we adults don't talk about that. We stay in our heads as adults. And and this experience really reminded me of like, oh, the importance of having young people to help define these terminology so that we can make sure that we're structuring our program to really meet their needs.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
one thing that stood out to me was like the resources, for example, making sure youth have like access to healthy and diverse snacks and even transportation to the youth program, because that's not something that you may think about. For example, if a youth does not have a job, like where are they going to get the money to access like public transportation? So it's just thinking about the whole experience, the youth coming into the program, like what are they feeling? How did they get to the program? What barriers are even like getting to the program, not even just within the program. So just thinking about their whole experience.
Thanks. So we identified these barriers, then we kind of got this idea of, okay, what should it look and feel like? And then what happens, Naya?
So together, we've developed 5 strategies to address these issues that we've identified. So the major question was, what actions are needed to remove these barriers and move towards the vision of equity that youth want? So from this work that we've done on this day, we've formed an implementation team that we've created learning opportunities based on these recommendations. And these learning sessions would highlight strategies for and lessons learned from the university, decentering its expertise and using its platform to engage and elevate youth and practitioner perspectives and practices. So the strategies are respond to youth identified needs, expose histories to unpack identities and practices, reconstruct the platform to redistribute power to youth, institutionalize inclusive practices, and prioritize accountability to youth and their communities.
So this really then became our guiding framework for, okay, if we're going to host a series of workshops, we want them to kind of be helping people understand and build some skills and self-efficacy, like understand they can do these kinds of things with these strategies in mind, right? So knew what happened after that as a result.
Yeah. So as a result of these strategies being surfaced by the community design team as really critical to advancing racial and youth equity, we also remembered that the community design team really emphasized the desire to acknowledge practitioner wisdom and practice-based evidence. And so as a result of that, the community design team wanted to offer several standing alone sessions that people can sign up for, as well as building a cohort learning opportunity for people to spend a lengthy time just digging into the work. And so in the fall of 2019, both were offered in various different kind of months throughout the fall. And the Youth Leadership Initiative, which included myself and my colleague, Sally Brown, we were the primary facilitators of the Youth Equity Learning Series, which was offered to 50 individuals. 50 individuals signed up from across about 17 organizations throughout the Minnesota area, primarily Twin Cities, but throughout the Minnesota area over a length of 8 months. And so we really spent time defining what is equity, what does youth equity look like. We had some specific sessions, and then we also had some sessions where teams can talk about what does this mean for us. and how do we start to change our practices? And yeah, I think it was really great. Some of the feedback that we got from participants were that it was really great to have practitioners as trainers, because they were doing the work, they were wrestling with some of these ideas, and we were able to offer suggestions and strategies that we were utilizing as practitioners at our work to advance youth equity. And so this was in the fall, and our goal was that in the spring, we would culminate with a kind of public forum where cohort members would share their experience. And then COVID hit. And so it was challenging. We could not do the public gathering. And so what we decided to do was to say, okay, let's pivot. We can't share our experience, but maybe what we could do is offer these, like, pick out of the 8 sessions we had, pick 3 key sessions that we really think would help people advance youth equity in their workplace, and do those virtual experiences in the fall of 2020 so that more people can sign up. Because with the cohort learning model, we wanted to keep the cohort to a specific group. And with the virtual workshops, anybody can sign up. More people will have access to the information. So it was really about sharing resources to the general public. And so that's what we did. In the fall of 2020, we designed 3 sessions, really focusing those 3 sessions. And so the first one was around dismantling white supremacy culture in our organizations. We felt like of all the 8 topics that we had, if like organizations or programs cannot really address some of those barriers and like institutional inclusive or exclusive practices, if they aren't addressing the fact that many of our organizations are rooted in white supremacy culture, right? That's just kind of the water that all of us are kind of swimming in. And if we don't name it, then we actually cannot explicitly dismantle that culture to try to create a more inclusive culture for our diverse population. The second equity workshop that we provided was around addressing our own adultism and how we show up in our youth work. And like we can't actually meet the needs of youth identified needs if we are not addressing the fact that how we show up really matters and how young people show up. And so really being intentional and kind of dismantling the ways that we perpetuate adultism that's harmful. And then the last session we did was sharing power with youth. And this was really addressing like that third strategy around redistributing the platform so that young people have power in decision making. And in our youth leadership program, we have it built into our structure in a couple of different ways where we are sharing power with youth, whether it's deciding what they want to do. They have facilitation and curriculum design authority. And so we really wanted to share with people that it's possible, and it's possible to structure your organization so that young people have kind of the highest level of power possible. And so all 3 of these it was set up so it didn't need to be a series where people didn't have to come to all 3. They could come to 1 or 2 or all 3 if they wanted to. And I thought that worked really well. The last thing I'll say is that for these virtual youth equity workshops, because I love in-person workshops, but because it was virtual, it enabled us to bring more youth facilitators. And so all of these 3 workshops were co-facilitated by young people. And so anyways, I think that was different and new. And in a way, we were definitely modeling the sharing power with youth because they were co-facilitators and sharing their experience.
Awesome. So more than really what we specifically did, I think for us, the takeaway for all of you would be some of these, as we reflect on the process and think about the lessons learned, I feel like there's hopefully some implications for what that would mean about you and the work that you're doing with young people. So we're just going to all kind of chime in as we maybe see amongst these what stands out Sumaya, you want to jump in?
Sure. One major reflection that I had was like how youth voices were taken seriously and included throughout the whole process. Like it's like for youth and then by youth. So it's like doing by not just talking, but by actions. And that stood out to me a lot.
Yeah, Sumaya joined the implementation team, so she played a key role in all of that. I would say the second one is probably speaking to me because might be my personality, which probably it definitely has some white supremacy cultural tinges to this idea that I was like, we have this time frame. I want to do it this way. I think it should go like this. We started moving or we weren't moving fast enough. And I thought, I just needed to like settle down, not kind of give in to that sense of urgency and really allow the process to take the time it needed, whether it was establishing shared understanding of things, whether it was building their relationships. Ultimately, so much things that happen, like even through COVID, right? I think we ended up with a better product that we would never have anticipated going into it because we were able to be a little more nimble and kind of move and respond to things as they unfolded. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add that from a practitioner community perspective, it was easy for us to always view like the you as one as the expert and also as thinking that they are the expert. And I've been to many, many symposiums before, and so I also had a kind of a biased experience of like, oh, this is how the you does their symposiums. And when we were all invited to show up differently, to really give our opinion, to be honest with the university, and then to also share new ideas, new ways that we can do this work together. I learned a lot that, oh, this traditional relationship of like unequal power dynamics can shift, right? And so that was really powerful for me that we can actually be real partners in thinking about the work, and that actually we could influence Kate and the university to shift the way they always think about like evidence-based work, and shift that to say let's focus on practice-based evidence. Let's focus on what people are doing in community that's working, that will help us advance youth equity. And so it was a lot of unlearning for me of how we can be in relation together, community and big institutions like the University of Minnesota. And that actually like we can decide together, we can pause together. I mean, there were definitely moments when we're like, Kate, no, wait, we got to go slower than you think. Sorry, that meeting did not happen the way you wanted to.
Right. But my Post-its, I was ready. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I had to give up that goal orientation as well. Like really going, I mean, I knew it didn't have to be how it had always been, but I didn't know what it was going to be like. And that was really hard, that developmental co-creation part, to be like, okay, so some people, instead of having these big symposia, they wanted more workshops. We wanted them housed in the community. We were going to have youth as co-facilitators. Each of that made it more complicated. It meant we had to do different stuff. We had to find different caterers or space or have more time for training. I mean, everything kind of disrupted, the ways that we were used to doing things. And so, and knowing that, hearing, oh, we want to have some in-depth learning through the cohort, but we also don't want to mean that you have to do it all. Maybe you just want to come to one session. So how do we have smaller workshops? So kind of trying to like do a lot of both and thinking was important.
Right. And in a way, we were modeling disrupting white supremacy culture in general, right? All of us together, this community design group. And we were practicing adaptive leadership, working with emergence, like all of that was happening, working with complexity. So I'm actually really proud that we made it. Kind of 3 years of partnership and design and thinking and rethinking. Yeah, but we did it because we were all committed to youth equity, right? Like we went through all the challenges together, even the moments of unknown. And but we were at the end of the day, like we came back together and said, what are we trying to do here? Right. And allowed that like aspiration to be better youth workers carry us together, and reminded us that we have each other through this, right? So difference of opinion it was fine. Like having different in our timelines were off, it's okay. So anyways, that was a great great experience and a great learning lesson. And like Kate said, I think the product was good at the end of the day because we were responsive to what people needed.
Something else that stood out to me is like hosting community expertise. So rethinking who are the people of knowledge. The people of knowledge do not only exist in university. So it was a big deal to like identify the different people and organizations within the community that are a big part of this work. It's not just like, you know, the university teaching the community. It was like mutual learning.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, and it came down even like well, the hosting for one, I mean, I think I used to think like, oh, we have this nice space and people maybe they like to come and have this special morning. We'll give you some nice coffee and treats and you get to come together on campus. Well, I mean, but like parking on campus is a huge barrier. It costs $10. And like people wanted to go and see each other's program sites. And they, you know, so having to be able to hear like what hosting, you know, it wasn't just I'm going to host the way I want to host. I had to host the way people want to come. So that was important. And it also led to the very last point, I think, too. You know, this work, it can be very transactional. I mean, I had got to oversee a budget to decide like, okay, I can pay you to deliver this piece. I can, you know, but I feel like it was received very differently. I mean, people came because they were invested in the product and wanting to be a part of a process. And I think felt like that it was going to look different. And so there was a lot of responsibility to make sure we followed through. I don't know, what does that last one mean to you guys, Nou and Sumaya?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would say also like for us who were facilitating like the learning series, I think that because we were all youth workers in the field, at the end of the day, we weren't just presenters and trainers to the audience and attendees, but we became a community of practice. So that was transformative, and so we offered like, hey, now we're a community. We know each other now. So if you need something, reach out, right? And so we created a community practice Facebook page for people to sign up so we can continue to share resources with each other. We provided technical assistance. So we drove to Duluth to visit one of our partners, to see their building, to hear about what they were actually doing and what they were challenged with. And we just had like an hour and a half brainstorming session. And so even as the trainers and participants, it changed our relationship from, oh, we're here to learn from something versus we're in community together and we're learning together. You know, we always said we're not the experts here, but we can share what we know, and then we want to learn from you all as well. We're all trying to do better work in community. So yeah, that transactional to transformational, I think that definitely happened on multiple levels.
Yeah, the way I see it is like transactional. It's like working with what exists, moving from working with what exists to creating something new. And the new thing is like the new process, new goals, and new roles. And the way we see like education and the way we include and the way people show up.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize how powerful throughout the whole process, like how we saw young people before as just recipients of our services and participants in our programs to, oh no, they're designers with us. They are thinking partners. They are facilitators and trainers. I think that was transformational throughout the process.
And I will just add too, while a lot of this work was happening, you know, with all kinds of youth serving organizations, there were 4-H clubs and teams that were a part of the cohort and came to our our sessions. We also brought the YLI team to do some training with our 4-H ambassadors and with our staff. But what I want to open up, I want to have some time to be able to hear from you first, of course, if you have questions, but also thinking about application. And I would just say, to kind of maybe lead into that, I feel like, you know, the 4-H program can be one of the more difficult ones to, I mean, we are rooted in a lot of these traditions. We're rooted in a lot of, you know, bureaucracy and policies and things, you know, things that are in place that kind of sometimes limit us from being able to do some of the things we just talked about. So I'd love for, I know we're a small crew here, but if people are open to just unmuting or, you know, throwing something in the chat, I'd love to hear your questions or any reactions to what this could mean for you in your own work. Meg, you're the only one I can see, and you look like you have stuff on your mind. I won't put you on the spot unless you want to
Totally
talk.
good. I was trying to find my, you know, you have to find your unmute button. Even after a year, we still can't find it. No, I had questions about the so what. So what are the next steps? You know, what are the things that you guys have seen actually come out of this as moving forward? And how do you get administration and the powers that be on board to really truly take those steps to work towards something like this? I mean, I think some of us try to do this independently in our counties. But it's really hard when it's not an entire system change. I mean, we can only do so much for the youth that we reach, but how do we encourage that system change? So that was a lot of questions.
I know, right?
Sorry.
I can start at the beginning where I think, you know, the so what, that sits with me in part because of how I think we knew the so what right away a year ago, like we need to pivot and we wanted to do these workshops, but all of these investments have usually been like a multi-year thing where we focus on a topic and then we're going to pick another topic. And they often, you know, they get embedded in our work, right? So people are still doing quality, they're still talking about social emotional learning, but it does sort of feel like I don't want to just turn the page. And I also want to figure out, you know, yeah, does this get built into, I mean, I guess I know within our own center, we do trainings, and I think some of the information and the tools will be embedded into like ongoing trainings that we are able to offer. But it's almost more like the so what for me is like the participants, whether they were in the cohort or in the sessions, you know, what did they take? How does it kind of ripple out? As opposed to having to be, again, resting on our kind of shoulders to say, now we will determine what is next, or with the so what. What else comes to mind for you?
Yeah, you know, I'll say that for the Youth Leadership Initiative, we were lucky that we were at a big organization, and in a way we were like stepchildren. This big organization was mainly human services, and we were the only youth leadership program. So they didn't really care much about what we were doing. And so as a director, I had a lot of power to do whatever I wanted and to innovate with this program that I'm in charge of. And so as I was learning over the years of what it meant to share power with young people, because we always had it in our design, but we weren't always good at practicing. We never saw everything, right? It took years for us to see something. So for example, it took me 8 years working in the Youth Leadership Initiative program to realize I care about youth equity and I want youth to share power in decision-making. They were facilitating programming and being peer mentors, and we were training them as such. But why was I not involving young people in evaluation? Why did I also, right? Why why did I think that like only the researchers were experts? And until I got a training in youth participatory evaluation, I didn't see that. And when I took that training, I'm like, oh, youth can be evaluators? Yeah, why not? They're the experts in their experience in our program. And it started to shift the way I was thinking. Now, of course, like everybody else, I was like, I'm too busy. I don't have time to like do another program. We have 4 days a week programming. And it took me another year to say, no, if you don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. Like all my staff were too busy. So because I cared about it, I invested time to do it. And so as a director, I was running the youth participatory evaluation team. So I engaged a couple youth. I taught them about evaluation and gave them the training about YPQA. And they started to do the YPQA self-assessments. So again, when you think about like systems change, it does need leadership support, right? Like you said, if many of us are trying to do all this stuff on our own, so if you don't get the leadership support of your managers and supervisors and maybe even directors or people who are developing curriculum, let's say for 4-H, to help you think about how do we structurally create change, it won't happen at the scale that it needs to. And so I would ask you to think about like, what are the barriers that's stopping you? Like once you are able to explicitly name those particular barrier points, then you can say, what do I need to leverage to change that, right? How do I address that particular barrier? And then of course, like part of when we developed the learning cohort, we were very specific about you cannot come alone. You must bring at least one other person from your organization or two, and some groups about 4. A team of 4, because we're like, you need to do this with other people. Like if your organization is going to change, you need more than just one mind. And so the other question is, how can you bring other people along with you on this journey? And sometimes you need to experiment to see the results. And once you see the results, other people will follow, right? Like I remember with the youth participatory evaluation, just doing that, people are like, oh, Nu's doing this thing over there. Like she's experimenting. We don't really know what it is, but they're busy. They're meeting every week. And until they saw the product, the final product, and they saw how it shifted, how young people got more invested in the program. And then they were like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. So your young people are giving you extra time to learn about evaluation, but through that process, they're more invested in your program, in the quality of the program. They're noticing things and they're making changes on their own. Wow, that's kind of neat. We want to do that too. How can we do that? And so sometimes you can't wait for other people to jump on the bandwagon before you create change. It is kind of this like chicken or egg, right? So you got to do it, demonstrate it, but also be bringing people along with you. But somebody needs to champion it. So if it's no one else, it's got to be you. Somebody needs to champion it. So I know structural changes are hard. I think that's why like talking and connecting, right? Building a network of support for you is so important. Yeah, even if it's a small group. Yeah. And I'll also add that for the Youth Leadership Initiative, we no longer are at this big organization that I mentioned before because they decided to close us down. And our young people said, heck no, this is too important. Like this changed my life. We cannot let this program die. And so we're birthing our own nonprofit, and which is really scary, but we're doing it. And we're expanding our mission to not just build the next generation of multicultural leaders, but we also want to be impacting the systems that serve them. Because through all of this work with Kate and others, that there's power in sharing practices, and especially helping adults advance youth equity, right? Like, because young people have told us, "Nu, this program is great, but as soon as I leave these walls, nowhere else out there is like here." And so we realize, oh, we can't just stay in our little lovely bubble of our program. We have to help change the systems around so that youth, no matter where they go, right? They are having these equitable systems that support them. And so our new mission is doing both, kind of systems change by helping catalyze change, by helping develop professionals skills and capacity to do this youth equity work, but also developing leaders to to create the change that they want. So that's kind of our little contribution to the world, that we want to be able to do both.
A big ripple.
Yeah. Be the ripple effect.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helpful. There's no real answers.
I
Just
think
a little bit of our experiences.
I went back to this. This was more addressed in the cohort and then in one of these webinars, but I feel like when I look at these, what were these called? They weren't
Characteristics of
just characteristics. You know, I can see certainly if the 4-H program in here a lot, right? I mean, if you just sort of think about some of these things and then think, well, what would the antidote look like? And we can even share a resource that really kind of works through some of that. But like this idea around that sense of urgency, that there's this one way, you know, that individualism, I mean, there's a lot of values that you know, anytime you take a legacy program like 4-H that has that kind of rich history and investment that goes from generation to generation, I mean, there's value in that, and then there's some big barriers that come with it too, right? And so I think just being able to like think about these things as not givens, and what would it look like to maybe say, well, okay, I know we always do it that way, or we always have, but like, what would happen if we didn't, you know? Be, you know, trying to like kind of the baby steps that way to kind of break that down. Yeah, thank you for sharing that article, New. Anybody else have any kind of questions or reactions? We covered it all. Sumaya, do you have anything else you would want to add before we wrap up?
I'd say like this whole process, you may think that you'd have to plan for it to happen and then continue throughout that plan, but it does involve a lot of reflection and adapting to the new knowledge that you learn as you go along.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I learned and gained more than anybody else did, but it was powerful. And I think as a process and I mean, again, outside of the deliverables, just sort of that process, again, identifying the barriers, the vision, and kind of, you know, okay, what would the strategies be, that process, as well as the community design team process for kind of how are we going to make decisions and kind of allocate resources. All of those things were just sort of like on the table with young people and with youth workers. So I would just encourage people to, yeah, try it out, see what happens, and reach out to any of us if you want to follow up with any other questions or anything. Yep, there's News Gmail. I can pop mine in there too.
Yep. You know, well, actually, one of the participants from the last virtual workshops that we just finished reached out and said they work in the library system in Egan, and they said that, you know, they're trying to reflect on all these learnings and what does it mean for their space and how they do their work. And the first step was just to say, okay, I've identified these things are happening in my space. And what is it that I need to do differently if I don't want these things to continue to be perpetuated? And I'm like, that's a great first step. That's wonderful that you can identify, oh my gosh, these things are happening and they're not helping me achieve my aspirations of building an inclusive, youth-friendly, youth-empowering space. I think that's, you know, if anything, that's kind of the first step. And yeah, this is kind of a journey, constant journey, right? Like I thought I was a great youth worker before. And I think I am.
She was.
But even so, I was like, oh my gosh, I was also being fed. I was drinking the Kool-Aid. And I needed to pause and reflect, like I could do better. And when I noticed it, it was the power of naming, right? Again, naming. When I noticed it and named it, I'm like, I do not want to only be perpetuating that. Everybody is an expert in their own lived experience, right? Then it took me a year and a half to fight with our expert researchers, our adult expert researchers, to include the youth observed quality recommendations in that report. Because they were like, oh no, that's okay. Your youth is doing that. That's fine. We're not going to include that in our final evaluation. Because this is official. This is like objective research, evaluating your program. And I'm like, no, this is really important. This might be even more important than yours because they actually live the experience, right, of our program. And so if you don't want to include this, I'm going to switch researchers. I need somebody who's going to support the power of youth voice. And so I switched researchers. And again, I was able to do that, right, as a director. And so I switched the researchers. And the new researcher, I invited them to come and witness the power of young people engage in critical thinking and evaluative thinking. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is my first experience. And wow, they're powerful. They know what they're talking about. I want to see the final result and I'm going to include it in the report. And so sometimes it's just the right people or the wrong people that you're dealing with. And so finding the right people who also is aligned with where it is that you want to take your program, it's big. Yeah.
Another thing that like stood out to me, I was also kind of unlearning as a youth participant, like knowing that my input has value and will be taken seriously because that doesn't always happen. So this space was unique. So like not holding my ideas back and being honest in the ideas and suggestions that I had in this process.
Mm-hmm. That's very powerful, Sumaya. Can I just add one more thought I had? That sometimes we may feel powerless as youth workers, being able to do the change that we really want because of the larger systems at bay. But I just want to remind all of us that like we have a lot of power. And so how do we leverage our power? And like even thinking about like young people, right? We have a lot of power over young people in our space. And so as long as we're paying attention to how we utilize our power, we have power and responsibilities. Yes, right. We can't deny that. But how do we use that in the service of young people is really important. And so we're in charge of creating spaces where Sumaya can show up and say, oh, wow, I'm valued here. I'm listened to. So that's really powerful. And then also just remember that, again, when you identify the people around you who with and along, you can have power together. So how do you leverage other people so that you have more power than just yourself? That's also really important. So even when sometimes our systems don't support us, we still have power. So to never lose sight of that and to continue the journey.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up. Thank you all again for joining us. We will post the slides and recording with JJ. And if there's, I'll stick around for a minute if anybody does have any more questions, but thanks for joining us. And I want to just thank my co-presenters and partners in crime, Nou and Sumaya.
Thanks, everyone.